Hey everyone,
Hey guys.
welcome to another Travel Therapy Mentor video. Tonight we're going to be talking about pursuing travel healthcare with a family. This is something we've gotten more and more questions on recently from people that either have kids, have a spouse, they're thinking about traveling, but they don't know how that would work. And the truth is, we've thought about it in the past too. We thought about maybe once we have a family, we would still continue to take travel contracts, something we still could consider doing in the future. So we've thought about it a lot over the years and done some research on it, as well as talked to a lot of people that have done it. So we want to bring you guys some ideas about how that might look. So Whitney's going to introduce us, and I'm going to get this video shared in a couple groups.
All right, hey guys, thanks for joining. My name is Whitney Aiken.
I'm Jared Kazazza.
And we're both traveling doctors of physical therapy. Many of you guys may know us as the faces behind Travel Therapy Mentor. We're kind of coming up on about 8 years of being traveling physical therapists. A lot of you guys may know us from way back when we first started our original blog, which is called Fifth Wheel Physical Therapist. We actually lived in a camper for the first 3 years that we were travelers, and we created a blog around the name of our Fifth Wheel camper. And then a few years in, we started our Travel Therapy Mentor site, where we bring you guys a lot of education about various travel healthcare topics, whether it's pay packages, negotiating contracts, setting up housing, all those questions that you have. And as Jared mentioned, we do quite often get questions about if it's possible to travel with the family, because more and more people are learning about what travel therapy is, what travel nursing is, and they want to know if there's any way that it could work for their situation. So we recently had one of our friends who's a travel nurse write a guest blog post for us. We put that out yesterday, so if you haven't had a chance to read that yet, you can go on our website at traveltherapymentor.com, click on Unique Traveler Stories, and Alex's post is up there. Alex is a travel nurse, and her husband is a physical therapist, and they've both traveled in the past as a couple, taking both travel nursing and travel therapy contracts. But now they have 2 kids, and they told us a little bit about their story of how they're making it work now with their kids. And we just wanted to get on here and talk about some different ideas, tell you a little bit about what we learned from them and their particular situation. But we also know that a lot of you all might be in a different situation where maybe you don't have a spouse or some other scenarios. So we want to talk through all that. If anybody that's watching, if you've either done travel healthcare with a family before, or if you're thinking about doing it in the future, we would just love if you'd leave a comment and let us know kind of what's your situation, what are you thinking about. We've definitely talked to more and more people that are thinking about, I'm enjoying it right now, I don't have kids yet, but I might be thinking about it, continuing it once I have kids, or the opposite, people who already have kids and are in a permanent job situation that are thinking about getting into traveling. So lots of different folks out there that are thinking about it. As Jared said, he's just going to share the video in a couple of groups for those that want to watch live here on Facebook. While he's doing that, also just a couple quick announcements. So we are in Mexico right now. We just got finished with a company-sponsored trip with Core Medical Group, and that was in Riviera Maya, kind of in the Cancun, Playa del Carmen area, and that was really fun. Every year they host a free trip for some of their travelers, and we got to meet up with a bunch of other travel nurses, travel physical therapists, travel OTs, and other disciplines. It was really fun. And we're spending just a couple more nights on our own in Cancun right now. I don't know if you guys can hear in the background, there's a bunch of dogs barking. We're just at an Airbnb in Cancun City. And we're actually hopped on a couple minutes late tonight because we were wrapping up dinner across the street at the local taco place. So we just got back from dinner. So tomorrow we are leaving for Mexico, and we're flying to the Virgin Islands. And we've never been to the Virgin Islands before. We're really excited. If anybody has any recommendations about the Virgin Islands, let us know. We're going to be staying in St. Thomas, and we're going to be going for the day, one of the days, to St. John, where the National Park of the Virgin Islands is. We're really excited. It's going to be our 62nd national park. So after this coming week, when we go to the Virgin Islands National Park, we'll only have one more national park that we haven't gone to yet.
Yeah, pretty exciting.
So again, if anybody's watching live, feel free to say hi. Feel free to hit the like button. I see a few of you guys are on live. And then shout out to those of you guys that will listen later. I know some of you will listen later on YouTube or our podcast or on Facebook as well.
All right, so the first thing that we should probably cover is why might you want to travel with a family? Usually the people that ask us questions about this are people that already have kids and a spouse. They hear that you can make more money traveling. They really don't want to be at their perm job. They want to travel the country. They want to see some other things. They don't necessarily want to wait until their kids are in college to go do that. And so they want to know how they could make that work, or potentially make it work, just exploring options. And yeah, I mean, it's basically a lot of the same benefits that most therapists choose to travel. Higher pay, being able to see the country, maybe try out different settings, those types of things. And it is more difficult, and certainly there's a lot more to think about than if you're just a single traveler or you're just a couple like us traveling together, especially if you have 2 kids or 3 kids. Finding housing is more difficult. There's a lot of more things to take into consideration.
Yeah, and there's definitely the other side of it too, where I know a lot of you guys that are current travelers, you really don't want to have to slow down and stop. You're loving travel so much, and you're like, well, if we do want to have kids and do want to kind of start a family, does that mean we have to stop traveling? Does that mean we have to forego all these fun benefits that we've been enjoying? And for a lot of people, a lot of the travelers that do it, they continue to do it with their children while they're still young. That tends to be a pretty widely held consensus that, it's like, oh, well, until they're 5, we don't even have to worry about school, so we'll just continue traveling, we'll just take the baby on the road. And then it can get a little more tricky once they're school age. But let's talk about just some of those considerations. First, we want to go over just a few different family types, and you can see if this type of scenario would fit your family type.
Yeah, the first one would be 2 parents and then either 1 or 2 or 3 kids. But 2 parents, and that can be 2 different situations. There are single families that travel, or single parents that travel together. We'll talk about that later. But it could be a situation where one of the spouses stays home with the kids, or it could be a situation where both spouses work on a travel contract. So maybe they're both therapists, or maybe one spouse is a travel therapist and the other one does like remote work or something at each assignment location.
Yeah, and so for a lot of people, it's really neat if you can both be healthcare workers and both make really good income working 2 contracts. But then you run into the issue of, well, what are we going to do about childcare now if both of us are working? So I think for a lot of people, when it's 2 parents, it's 2 spouses, it just makes a lot of sense for them to have one person work the travel healthcare contracts and the other person stay home with the children. And now you've eliminated the childcare issue. And this is something really interesting that Alex brought up, our friend that wrote the guest post. She was saying that she's a nurse and her husband's a physical therapist. And for a little while, they did go home. It just made more sense to have some stability. It was actually during COVID as well when she was just had her first child. And they were like, oh, it'll be good to have some stability. We'll be with family. But they were both trying to work these 2 jobs just to afford having childcare at home. Whereas if she went and took some travel nursing contracts, they could afford to live on just the one income and not have to pay for childcare because you're making so much more with travel healthcare. And that can just free up so much time and space and ability to be one of you to be home with your child rather than having to put them in childcare and just break even financially, right?
Yeah, and let's take the example of 2 therapists that are working perm jobs. We didn't realize this, and probably a lot of single people or people without kids don't realize this, but childcare has gotten really expensive. And I was just talking to a friend of ours at the gym, and then also this article, they were both talking about childcare. And both of them were saying that the average is between like $2,000 and $3,000 per kid per month for childcare. That's something we did not realize, that childcare could be that expensive. So if you think about 2 therapists working perm jobs and paying for childcare, and then one person stops working to take care of the kids on a travel contract, well, then you eliminate the childcare costs, and you also are making usually 1.5 times to 2 times as much on a travel contract as you would on a perm job also. So there's a lot of situations where if you have 2 therapists that are spouses with kids, if one stops working, stays home, and you take a travel contract, you could come out ahead significantly financially and not have to worry about childcare, and probably your kids get a little bit better care at home anyway.
Yeah. But if you were 2 parents that went together and maybe both of you wanted to work, if you were both therapists or both in healthcare, or the other one of you wanted to continue to do maybe a remote job or something, we definitely have heard people doing that as well. You just may have to work in a little more childcare options there. For example, we have 2 friends that were both therapists, and they traveled for a little while with their daughter. And they both were taking home health contracts, and they were able to make their schedules really flexible with their home health contracts, where they only had to have a babysitter part-time, not full-time. They were able to have relatively short days or stagger their days or whatever it might be. And so there are some cases where it can still really work out in your favor for both of you to take a travel contract. And the same thing, like if one of you were able to work remote, well, we all know, working remote doesn't just mean you can also do the duties of taking care of the kids, but maybe you could do it some of the time, like if you didn't have meetings or whatever it might be, or if you only worked part-time remotely, then you could get childcare part-time. But it can definitely be a challenge to find childcare in each new assignment location.
Yeah, and I think that probably is the hardest thing. If you're two spouses working and you both want to continue working, finding childcare is going to be difficult. And we also didn't realize this as people without kids, that some of the childcare is also very competitive. So it's not only very expensive, but there's a lot of people vying for a small number of spots at the best daycare centers. And so then not only are you paying a lot of money, but you're out of town and you're not top of the list, obviously, for these slots. So finding childcare can be difficult. So that would be the biggest barrier for two spouses that want to continue working while taking a travel contract.
Yeah, and we've definitely heard some other barriers with childcare. Like I know we had another friend that said that some daycares won't let you do part-time as an option. They only want you full-time, or they're going to give the spot to someone else that can do full-time. So that could be a challenge, or it could be that they don't want you because you're only there short term, or it could also be that you might have some trust issues because you're not familiar with the childcare in the new area. So I think childcare is definitely a big hurdle for some people if they were in that situation. But it definitely seems like a lot of the couples that we talk to, when they have both spouses present, it makes so much more sense for one of them to stay with the children while the other one works.
Yep. Nick says, hello, no kids, no wife. I've evaded capture for 38 years.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for chiming in.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so then another option that we had actually thought about, this was several years ago when we were kind of early in our travel careers, and we were just thinking like, what will our future look like? What will we do when we are deciding to settle down and have kids? Will we keep traveling? And we had even talked about all kinds of ideas. We had talked about like bringing one of our moms along to babysit for us and be a nanny. We lived in the camper at the time, and we were like, oh, we'll get mom a camper, and we'll have a camper, and we'll just roll into the campgrounds together, and she'll be the built-in babysitter. She'll be retired. She'll love it. So we talked about all kinds of stuff, and we've heard of other people also bringing a nanny along, but I think it would probably have to be like a family situation, because you probably can't just afford to pay a full-time nanny to come and live in another state with you, right?
No,
unless it was
not.
a family member, or unless they had some kind of really flexible situation.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different circumstances that you might be in, which makes all of this hard to talk about, and why we want to cover just some of the different options, because everyone's family circumstance is different.
Yeah, and we just know, we're on here talking about it. No, we haven't done it ourselves before, but we've chatted with just dozens and dozens of people over the years, and we know that quite often our audience just likes to hear some commentary on some different ideas that we have, or different ideas that other people have. So we just tried to gather as much information as we could and just bring you some different ideas. Maybe it's something that you haven't thought of before. And the other thing too is I think a lot of what we do with social media and with our blog and with our podcast is awareness. We bring awareness to different topics, because probably 10 years ago people would have maybe never thought about traveling with their kids. Maybe they just would have thought that's not possible. Maybe even before COVID they would have thought that's not possible. But now when COVID happened, I feel like everybody just saw more possibilities in a work-life balance and flexible lifestyles, with travel healthcare, with remote work, with all these things. So we also just want you guys to be aware that this is a thing. People are doing it. If it's a goal of yours, if it's something you're really interested in, you could probably make it work, because guaranteed someone else has made it work.
Yes, almost every possible situation I think we've heard about at this point. So you can make almost anything work. It just depends on, what are your reasons for traveling, and what are you able to put up with in terms of various circumstances and hardships, because everything has pros and cons.
Mm-hmm. So the next thing we want to talk about is, what if you were a solo parent and you had your children or your one child, and you were wondering, could I be, a single parent who is a travel nurse or a travel therapist? You can definitely do it, but we definitely think it's going to be harder because of what we talked about already, the childcare. Where I could see the situation working out really well, and some people that we've talked to, is, for one, if you're a nurse and you only have to work 3 shifts a week rather than 5 shifts. That can make it a little easier, because now you don't have to find childcare quite often.
Yep.
If you could somehow, as another discipline, find shorter shifts or find part-time contracts, that could also be an option to reduce your childcare burden there. The other thing I've also heard some people talk about is later in life, starting to travel when they already have a teenager who's relatively independent, and maybe they can kind of self-guide in homeschooling. I don't have a lot of experience with this, so if anybody else does, please comment. But from what I've heard, a lot of times once they're teenagers, it's really self-guided, these online homeschooling programs. And so if they were pretty independent and they could stay at home, during the day and homeschool themselves essentially with the guided programs, then you might be able to be a single parent that takes your kid on the road.
Yep. Another situation that we have heard people do, and a lot of times this is also nursing, but it can work for therapy too, is say you have a family, 2 kids at home, one of the spouses will take travel contracts a couple hours away, 2 or 3 hours away, which usually you can find as long as you have a pretty, you're in a reasonable area and you have a big window of distance that you're willing to go. And then also if you're pretty lenient on setting, you can find something. And maybe you just go away you work 4 10s and you go there for 4 10s and then you come back home and then spend time with your kids and your family for 3 days a week. Or maybe if you're a nurse, you do 3 12s, you travel out there for 3 days, you come home and you spend 4 days at home. So sometimes you can make that work as well. And depending on your circumstances, that might be a lot easier than taking a travel contract across the country.
Yeah, we've definitely talked to a lot of people that have done this, whether it was leaving their spouse behind or leaving their spouse and their children behind. Just doing some contracts here and there where it's within driving distance to home, so you can come home most weekends, or sometimes the kids and your spouse can come and meet you while you're on assignment. It's definitely not ideal for everybody, but for some people it can be so financially beneficial that they're willing to, for a couple of years, put up with that kind of hassle because it can set you up so well financially. Especially I would say for nursing, like when you can go a couple hours from home and make triple what you could be making at a perm job, and then maybe you only do it part of the year, maybe you only do it 6 or 9 months a year, and the other 6 or 3 or 6 months a year you're at home and you're actually going to spend more time with your kids and more time with your family. So we've absolutely talked to a lot of people that do travel and leave their family behind because it makes sense for them.
And that could be very similar to what we've talked about in the past, semi-retirement, which is what we've been basically doing since 2018, is just taking more time off. As a traveler, you make more money. You can usually make what you'd make at a perm job in 6 months, working 2 contracts. And you could do some sort of semi-retirement where you think I don't want to be away from my family. But if it meant being away from your family 4 days a week or 5 days a week, only half of the year, and then getting to spend all of your time there the other half of the year, that might be worth it.
Mm-hmm. And with that said, when we're talking about trying to find more local jobs, we do get people reaching out to us all the time that kind of have that idea, but they're like, could I do one local enough that I could commute from home? Possibly, but like we've talked about in a lot of our past videos, it can be harder to find a travel job only within an hour radius of home. And it really depends on where you live and the job market availability for your discipline and your setting. Now, if you live in a really big metro area like San Francisco and you're willing to work in any setting, then yes, you could consistently find travel jobs within an hour of San Francisco year round. But if you live in rural Kansas, you might not be able to find a job within an hour ever, a travel job, but you could maybe within 2 or 3 or 4 hours, yes, you could maybe consistently find jobs, but will you be able to drive home every night? Maybe not.
Yeah, and honestly, the majority of our contracts, especially when we started the first few years, almost all of our contracts were within 5 or 6 hours of where we're from. And our area doesn't especially have a lot of jobs, so you can definitely make that work. Within 4 or 5 hour drive, there should be a decent number of contracts for you to choose from.
Yeah.
It's not like you're really limited if you're willing to go 4 hours in any direction.
Yeah, and 4 or 5 hours, we weren't going home every weekend, but if we needed to go home for a wedding or for some special event, once a month or whatever, you can definitely come home and make it work. But yeah, you just have to, it depends on where you live if you're going to be able to find them really close to home or not.
Yep. Okay, so one of the considerations is that we should probably go over is how old are the kids? Because I think when kids are younger, it's a lot easier. Obviously, you do have to find childcare, but you're not moving schools or doing anything like that. I think when you have school-aged kids, it's a lot harder because either you're going to have to homeschool or they're going to be moving all the time, which I don't think most parents would want to have their kids moving from school to school all the time, and I don't think kids would want to do that either. So homeschooling or kids that aren't school age yet is probably the easiest situation.
Yeah, and I would say the majority of people that we talk to typically are traveling with kids that are not school age yet because that's the easiest thing to do, or maybe they have one that they're having to homeschool while the other one is still young. But like we said, it depends on what your goals are, what you feel comfortable with. If the pros outweigh the cons for you, there are definitely people that do travel with school age kids. It just might be a little more difficult.
Yep. Another thing that obviously you need to think a lot about is housing. how are you going to find housing for, say, 4 people instead of just 1 or 2 people? And we have experience with this, just finding 2 places for 2 people. It limits your options. Having 2 people limits your options more than 1 person. Having 3 people limits your options more than 2. Having 4 limits it more than 3. The more people you have, the harder it is to find housing. And the reason for that is it's not an option to have a 1-bedroom a lot of times if you have 2 parents and 2 kids. So you need a bigger place, which obviously limits your studio and 1-bedroom apartment options. Whereas if you're a couple like us, we'll stay in a studio if it's a pretty nice place, or we'll stay in a 1-bedroom. So you'll just have less housing options, which brings up the possibility of traveling in a camper. And we have experience with this as well. We did that for 3 years, and we also did short-term housing, so we can compare the two. And I think for a lot of people, families that want to travel together, especially families that have pets, an RV would be a great option. And I think a lot of the travel families end up going that direction because it's just easier to have some consistency. You don't have to pack up as much when you're moving from place to place.
Yeah, and now you might be thinking, well, that seems like really a cramped area to be in a camper. But a lot of campers are very spacious, and we definitely, the families that we've talked to that have done this, most of them get one that has 2 bedrooms. They typically get the style that's called, has a bunk house. So one of the bedrooms has bunk beds for the children, and that way they have their own space. There's a common area, and then there's a separate bedroom for the parents. We've heard of people cramming in 3 kids and 3 dogs and everything. Campers are actually fairly spacious.
Yeah.
And then with that too, you're typically going to be at campgrounds where it encourages your family to be outside more. And a lot of times the campgrounds will have playgrounds and maybe pools and different outdoor entertainment options for you guys. So we've heard of a lot of people, I would say the majority of the people that we've talked to that travel with kids prefer the RV life. Now, not to say it doesn't come with its own headaches. We've done numerous videos and written articles about the pros and cons of RVing because we lived in one. It doesn't come without its own headaches, but it seems like that consistency in your living environment and not having to pack and move and wonder if you're going to have a good housing situation at each location really outweighs the cons of RV life for people.
Yeah, one of the biggest cons though of an RV, and something you'd have to think about if that was a direction you might want to go, is the upfront costs of the RV and potentially the truck or whatever tow vehicle you use, if it's a 5th wheel or a travel trailer. That can be very expensive, and depending on your situation, that may or may not be worth it. It might be one of those things where you want to do short-term housing, save up some money first, or maybe right away you just buy it and you just you take into account that you're going to save a little bit of money each month on the campground, so you just have that payment for the RV and the truck that you're making separately, and you have that monthly savings versus getting a furnished place.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to take into account whether or not RV life is going to be for you and your family or not. I will say, it's not totally impossible for you all to consistently find 2-bedroom apartments. There are lots of people out there that rent 2-bedroom apartments furnished for their contracts, whether it's because they just like to have more space, they like to have a guest room for when people come, or because they have a spouse, or maybe the spouse needs an office room, or because you have children. So you can certainly find short-term rentals that are 2-bedroom. If you go much beyond 2-bedroom, though, you're not going to quite often find 3-bedroom, unless you rent an entire house. But it's just going to get a little more tricky, and I think the consistency is the thing that we've heard the most, where people are like, well, if I'm going to uproot my kids and bring them with me all the time, it might help to just have that same space for them, so they don't necessarily feel like they're moving to a new home every 3 or 6 or 9 months. It's just what's outside of the camper looks different.
Yeah, and I can say from our experience, having done both, if we were going to travel with kids, we would definitely do an RV because, like Whitney said, there's definitely downsides, but I think finding places short-term and having consistency and knowing that you're not going to be, you never know what you're going to get into with short-term housing. Whereas with an RV and a campground, if you get there and you really hate it, it's not that hard to move to another campground. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you get to a short-term place, your contract starts soon, you move everything in, it's not easy to move to the next place. So I think we would go the RV route.
Yeah, and I think the thing that we really loved about RVing, even though there were a lot of negatives for us, is just not having to pack and move our stuff a lot. And as an individual or as a couple, you can kind of minimalize and get your stuff down where you have a pretty good routine packing it into your car and moving it to the next place. But I can only imagine the amount of stuff you have once you have children. And so I think having all your little things packed away in your cabinets where they go, having the toys where they go, having that just put it in your camper and just hitch it up to the truck and go, I think is going to be so much easier for a lot of families than to have to pack and move and unpack and get settled in. It definitely sounds daunting in a lot of ways.
Yeah. All right. So some other things to think about. Pros, cons, just little things that you might not consider. Lack of community. So when you're traveling with kids, there might not be as many options of things for them to do. Like you wouldn't have the consistency with playmates, things like that, which can be very important to some parents and some children. So you have to think about how your kid is and how important those types of things are to you, because you're definitely not going to have that consistency with community that you would have back home.
Yeah, and for some people this might be a big negative, because maybe you want your families to be more involved, as the child is young and as the child is growing. And now if you're moving them across the country all the time, maybe they're not going to get to see grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles and things as often. And so that's definitely something to take into consideration. And so for this reason, some people may prefer to take contracts closer to home, like maybe within a couple state radius, so that you can still visit, your family can still visit. Or the other thing to think about too is you still have that lifestyle flexibility. So maybe this is something you and your family are really passionate about doing, but you only choose to work 9 months out of the year. So then you can spend 3 months or so, maybe a month here and there at home. And then you're getting that really good quality time with your family when you are home every 3 months or every 6 months. So, there's pros and cons there, and you just kind of have to talk it over and decide, is this the right fit for my family or not? Or would I just really prefer to be like at home with my little community?
Yep. Another thing that Alex brought up that I would have never thought about is, in addition to childcare for, just during the day while you're at work, is finding a babysitter if there's a time that you want to go out together with your spouse, a date night or something like that. How are you going to find babysitters in each location? That can be difficult, especially since you don't know necessarily who to trust in a new location. You don't have feedback from friends or family of babysitters that you might have back home. So that's something to definitely consider as well.
Yeah, because it sounds like you're going to want your alone time sometimes, because it could get a little crazy if you're always with the children, and especially if you're living in a camper. And if you're not at home with your usual support systems, you can't just drop them off with grandma for the night while you go out to dinner. Yep. So definitely take that into account as well.
Something else that Alex brought up was that finding gyms with childcare can be very helpful. So if you're on an assignment and you find a gym that will keep the kids for an hour or two while you're working out, then that can give you a little bit of alone time from the kids, when you're at home from work. So it's not just work and then with the kids, work and with the kids. Maybe you get a little bit of time to work out and be on your own if you find a gym that has childcare.
Another therapist that we talked to that has children and travels with his spouse, Michael, he was mentioning joining online groups for people that travel with kids, and in their case specifically families that travel in RVs. And he was saying that he found a lot of support and a lot of advice in those groups. I think that's a great idea. Like I said, you're not the first one to do this. If you set out and you embark on this crazy thing and you tell your family you're going to do it, they're going to say nobody does that. But if you go online, you're going to find all kinds of people that do it, and they're going to have so much advice and support for you. Because I guarantee, whether it's travel, healthcare, or some other industry, there's all kinds of nomadic people out there living in RVs and traveling around, living in vans, taking their kids on the road, going to all the national parks, doing everything, working remotely. It's all over Instagram, it's all over Facebook. You can find support groups and find advice for little tips and tricks and hacks to make it work.
One other thing to consider is if you're traveling with a family, you probably are going to want to try to extend contracts more than you would as a single or a couple traveling together, because then you at least have a little bit more consistency for a longer time. So 6, 9 month, maybe even year-long contracts are probably going to be a lot better than 3-month contracts where you're moving a lot more often. So, when you're interviewing for jobs, that might be something you ask. If it's a job that sounds like they're probably going to hire somebody after a couple months, maybe that's not one you want to choose. You might want to go to one that has had a harder time finding perm people, and you'll be able to stay out longer, because that will be easier.
Yeah, and it's not always the case. We definitely know people that move around at the same rate that other therapists move around. I can just only imagine that it might be nicer to have a little more stability and a little more consistency for more like 6 months or 9 months instead of moving as quickly. Because we just remember when we were, moving around doing 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, it was a little tough sometimes, and sometimes we preferred to stay 6 months just for ourselves.
Yeah, we often would rather stay 6 months or 9 months at a contract if it was one that we liked versus moving every 3 months, and that would definitely be even more the case with kids or family.
Yeah. So if anybody is watching this live and you have any questions or you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it in the comments. Same as if you're listening later on the replay. If you have any questions or comments, leave them. We would love to hear feedback from more of you guys that are traveling with your family or have traveled in the past. A lot of people reached out to us on Instagram that have also done it before. So we know there's a lot of you all out there that have done it before. It's definitely possible, so we'd love to hear your feedback. Many of you guys may be wondering what we're going to do. We are definitely thinking about having kids in the next year or so. And as many of you know, we don't work full-time anymore as therapists, so we don't take back-to-back contracts anymore. So we won't be needing to worry about that so much as far as like taking travel therapy contracts and bringing our children along. But we're definitely not ruling out still having, a flexible travel lifestyle. But right now we are leaning more towards being at home for at least a year or so once we start to have kids, just to have that consistency and that stability. But then we'll just kind of leave it open. And luckily we have a lot of flexibility in our life right now where we can just do what feels right.
Yeah, right now it feels like consistency. It's something that I've been craving for quite a while because we travel so much. We have for basically 8 years straight now, just either travel contracts or traveling internationally, doing all the trips that we do. So it feels really good to think about having some consistency. But at the same time, I think probably 6 months into being at home, I will feel like I really want to travel again. So we'll just have to see how all that plays out.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that for sure. But it could be, we could have some updates for you in the next year or so about what it's like to have children, because we were thinking about moving down that route. So any advice is welcome because we have no idea what we're doing.
Yep.
But we'll see. All right, well, if nobody has any questions that's on live, we will wrap up. But yeah, feel free to reach out. We can definitely try to connect you with other people that we've talked to that have children, that have done this before. You can read that article that Alex wrote for us, and we're going to be sharing another article soon from our friend Michael, who travels with his family as well. And then you can get their contact information if you want to reach out to them as well.
Yep, feel free to leave any questions or comments later. And if you would, please like this video. It helps us out, and we always appreciate it.
Yeah. So stay tuned. We're going to be in the Virgin Islands for the next week. You guys can follow along with our trip on Instagram. And then after that, we'll be back home for a little bit, and we are going to do another job market update here in a couple of weeks, probably at the beginning of April. We're going to do another travel therapy job market update, so stay tuned for that. And we'll talk to you guys soon.
All right, take care.
Bye.